She had learned to make herself small, not metaphorically literally. Through years of careful practice, Mara had perfected the art of collapsing her shoulders, dropping her gaze, and moving through the halls of Ironveil Pack territory like a shadow that apologized for existing. It had kept her alive. It had kept her invisible. And invisibility, she had long ago decided, was the only mercy this world offered a girl born without a wolf. The others knew. They always knew. A packmate without a wolf was not simply weak, she was wrong. A mistake the moon goddess had forgotten to finish, and the wolves of Ironveil had never been shy about reminding her. The bruises came and went. The name stayed. What Mara had never counted on was the night the Alpha King rode into Ironveil with fire in his eyes and stopped in the middle of a courtyard full of bowing wolves and looked directly at her. She had been bleeding. She had been trying not to cry. She had been absolutely certain that the worst moment of her life was still happening. She had been wrong about that last part. Mara had been born 22 years ago in the same birthing room as every other wolf in Ironveil, to a mother who had smelled the wrongness immediately and had wept quietly into the blanket while the midwife recorded the birth with careful, neutral handwriting. Father, unknown. Mother, Dina, Omega rank. Child, female. Wolf, absent. Her mother had died 6 years later, which was perhaps a mercy Dina had possessed, a quality of grief so constant and so quiet that it functioned like an illness. Mara did not blame her for it. She had understood even at 6 that her mother loved her desperately and could not reconcile that love with the shame. Both things had been true at once. Both things had broken Dina down to something that could not survive a bad winter. After that, Mara had been raised by the pack in the way packs sometimes raised their inconveniences collectively, grudgingly, and with the specific cruelty that comes from people who consider themselves obligated but not willing. She had worked for her keep. At 6, she had swept the Great Hall. At 8, she had learned to cook. At 12, she had been assigned to laundry. At 14, she had been put in the stables, which she had preferred, because horses did not care whether you had a wolf inside you, and the smell of hay was honest in a way that people rarely were. She had grown up strong despite everything, or perhaps because of everything, small-framed but capable, with dark hair that grew too fast and deep brown eyes that had, in an early act of self-defense, learned to see more than they revealed. She was quick with her hands and slower with her trust, and she had developed, over 22 years of careful survival, a talent for reading a room the moment she entered it. Who was in a good mood? Who was coiled? Who had been drinking? These were skills that had nothing to do with wolves and everything to do with staying intact. The bullying had evolved with her. When they were children, Riven and his friends had knocked her food from her hands and called her hollow. That was the word they used, hollow, as if she were a tree rotted out from the inside. By the time they were teenagers, the knocking had become shoving. The shoving had occasionally become worse, and the names had accumulated layers the way sediment builds. Hollow, ghost girl, the nothing. The mistake the moon goddess left unfinished. Riven was the Alpha's nephew, 18 months older than Mara, and he wore his status like a weapon that never had to be sharpened because no one was ever going to take it from him. By 22, Mara had learned which hours were safest, which paths through the territory added distance but subtracted danger, and which expressions to wear in which company. She had learned to say yes, of course, and I'm sorry, and forgive me, with a fluency that cost her something each time, but cost her less than the alternative. She had also, and this was the secret she kept most carefully, learned to read. Not just letters, everyone could read letters, even the pack's least educated members. Mara had taught herself, over years of borrowed books and stolen candle hours, to read the old language, the language of the moon goddess texts, the foundational scripts of pack law, the records that predated Ironveil's current leadership by 6 generations. She read them because she had nothing else, and because knowledge, unlike strength or speed or a wolf, could not be taken from you in a hallway. It was a specific passage in a text she had found 3 years ago, tucked between 2 rotting support beams in the stable loft, wrapped in oilcloth as if someone had hidden it deliberately that had first given her the thought she could not unthink. The passage was about wolves, who were born outside the ordinary pattern, about gifts that registered differently, about the possibility that the absence of a wolf did not always mean absence. It might, the text suggested, mean containment. Mara had read that page until the candle burned to nothing. She had memorized it. And then she had carefully, methodically, tried to push the hope back down, because hope was the most dangerous thing she owned. She was still pushing it down on the evening the Alpha King arrived. She had been in the courtyard near the eastern gate, she had been told, to bring fresh water to the gate guards, a task that required 2 full buckets and a path that took her directly through the center of the greeting yard. She had timed it badly. She had not known the king was coming. Very few people in Ironveil had known, which was apparently the point. An unannounced visit from King Aldrich of the Northern Throne meant that something was wrong, that information had been requested and not received, and that whatever pretense Ironveil's Alpha had been maintaining was about to be tested without the benefit of preparation. She had been crossing the yard when she heard the horses. She had stopped, and then Riven had stepped out of the shadows beside the granary, and the bucket had left her hands before she'd registered he'd moved toward her, water cascading across the cobblestones, and his fist had connected with her shoulder hard enough to drop her to one knee. "Wrong place, hollow girl," he said. The way someone says a thing they have said so many times it has lost all sensation. He stepped over her bucket. He kept walking. Mara stayed on one knee on the wet cobblestones and breathed carefully and did not cry, and the horses came through the eastern gate, and that was when it happened. She became aware of the stopping before she understood it. The hoofbeats changed, not stopping entirely at first, more like a deliberate slowing, the rhythm breaking, and then a silence where sound had been. She kept her eyes down. She was counting. She had learned to count when she was trying not to cry. 1, 2, 3, 4. It gave the feeling somewhere to go. Stop. The voice was quiet, not loud, not theatrical. It was the voice of a man who had said stop only twice in his life, and had both times been immediately obeyed. And he was saying it now, and she understood from the absolute quality of the stillness in the yard that he was saying it about her. Mara looked up. She could not help it. Something in that voice bypassed the careful training of 22 years and reached directly into whatever she was made of and pulled. The man on the black horse was exactly what the stories had described, and nothing like what she had imagined, which was a peculiar combination. He was large, not in the exaggerated way of pack enforcers who had weaponized their size, but in the way of something that was simply built to its own scale, broad across the shoulders, long through the limb, with the kind of presence that made the courtyard seem smaller than it had been a moment ago. His hair was dark, his jaw was a hard line. His eyes from this distance were not yet readable, but they were fixed on her with an attention so complete and focused that Mara felt, for a disorienting moment, that she was not invisible at all, that she had never, in fact, been invisible to the right eyes. He dismounted. That was unusual, and Alpha King did not dismount in a greeting yard to approach a kneeling servant girl. He did it anyway. He did it with a fluid economy of movement that suggested it had never occurred to him that this might be unusual, or that if it had occurred to him, the consideration had lasted approximately half a second before being dismissed. He walked to her and stopped 2 feet away, and she looked up at him because she could not look at anything else, and she felt it hit her, the recognition, the thing she had no name for yet, the sudden, violent rearrangement of everything she had believed to be true about herself and the world and what was possible for someone like her. It felt like being torn open. It felt like being repaired. His nostrils had flared at the same moment hers did. She saw it happen. He saw her see it, and something shifted behind his eyes, something cold becoming something else, something careful and almost afraid, and then very, very controlled. "Get up," he said quietly, not cruelly, as though the sight of her on the ground were a problem he intended to solve. She got up. Behind him, the entire assembled guard of Ironveil Pack and the full retinue of the Northern Throne stood in absolute silence, and no one breathed, and no one spoke. And Mara became slowly aware that her shoulder was aching, that her cheek was still damp from the water that had splashed up when the bucket dropped, and that the Alpha King of all the Northern Territories was looking at her the way she had only ever read about in texts that described the mate bond, which was a thing she had been certain could never happen to a girl born hollow. His name was Aldrich, and he had been carrying his own damage for long enough that it had shaped him, not destroyed him. Aldrich was not a man who destroyed easily, but shaped him, the way water shapes stone, leaving something that was true to its original form, but altered in the places that had taken the most force. He had been 26 when he claimed the Northern throne, and he was 31 now. And in the 5 years between those 2 points, he had done the work of a man who intended to rebuild a shattered thing correctly. Not quickly, but correctly. The Northern Territory had been fractured when he took it. Border disputes, pack hierarchies that had calcified into something closer to feudalism, alliances that were maintained through fear and therefore always one crisis away from collapsing. He had addressed these things with patience and with a capacity for strategic coldness that his advisors admired and his enemies feared, and that he himself recognized as a wall he had built around something he did not want examined too closely. His wolf's name, the internal name, the true one, was KL. KL had been silent for 2 years, not absent. Aldrich had felt him there, a heavy presence at the back of his consciousness, present as stone is present, immovable and patient, but silent, as if waiting for something so specific that commentary on anything less was not worth the breath. He had not expected to find it in a broken-down pack in the Midlands on an inspection that was supposed to be about supply routes. He had not expected to feel it the moment his horse cleared the eastern gate, a pull so sudden and specific that he had, genuinely, for a fraction of a second, not understood what it was. His body had understood before his mind had. His wolf had come roaring out of 2 years of silence with a single word, like someone who had been patiently waiting for a very specific door to open and had simply walked through it without preamble. Mine. That had been the word. One word, delivered with the full weight of 2 years of accumulated certainty. And then he had seen her, on her knees on wet cobblestones, not crying, holding herself together with a stillness that he recognized because he had taught himself the same kind of stillness, and someone had just hit her. He had seen it from the gate, and the man who had done it was walking away as though she were furniture. Aldrich had been a controlled man for 5 years. He had practiced control the way other men practice swords. He had gotten very good at it. He had dismounted. He had not been able to stop himself, and he had not tried very hard to, which told him something important about the nature of what was happening. She was small, and she was not small. That was his first coherent thought about her, after mine. She was slight in frame, dark-haired, with eyes that were doing the specific thing that eyes did when a person was trying very hard not to show what they were feeling. And she had looked up at him when he said stop with an expression he would spend the next 3 weeks trying to describe accurately to himself and failing. Because the only honest description was that she had looked at him the way he felt, as if some organizing principle of her world had just quietly reassembled itself around a new center, and she was still catching up. Her scent was extraordinary. He was not going to think about that in a public courtyard with 40 witnesses. He was going to think about it later, at length, with the methodical attention he brought to every significant new variable in his life. Right now, he needed to understand what he was standing in. He got her to her feet, which was the first and most immediately necessary thing. He turned to the assembled yard to Alpha Brennan, who had arrived at the edge of the courtyard with the expression of a man walking towards something he could not quite see clearly yet and liked less the closer he got, and he said, in the tone that he used when something was not a request, but he had decided to frame it as one anyway, I'll need lodging. And I'll need to speak with you about your pack's management of its members. He had used a specific word there. Members, not servants, not omegas, members. Alpha Brennan had heard it. Aldrich could tell by the way the color had briefly rearranged itself in the older man's face. Good. What he did not do, what he forced himself, through genuine effort, not to do, was look at her again before he walked away. Not because he did not want to, because he wanted to with a ferocity that would have been visible to anyone watching closely. And there were 39 people watching closely in that courtyard. And she did not yet know what she was to him. And he was not going to announce it in a greeting yard when she was still wet from a dropped bucket and had just been thrown to the ground. She deserved better than that. The certainty of this arrived complete and immediate, the way all the important things had, since he'd cleared that gate, not reasoned, just known. He told himself he would find a way to speak with her privately. He told himself he would be careful. He lasted approximately 4 hours. The feast that Ironveil's Alpha had assembled on short notice had the specific quality of hospitality that is actually performance, the correct foods appearing with just slightly too much visible effort, the correct deference from every ranked wolf in the hall, the toasts that were crafted with the precision of people who had not expected to be tested, but intended to demonstrate that they could have been. Aldrich ate and spoke and asked his questions and filed the answers, and his wolf kept a constant low-frequency attention on the door. And she did not appear at the feast because servants who were not wolves did not eat at the alpha's feast table. He knew where she was without having to ask. He could feel her in the building the way you feel a low sound not heard. Exactly, more registered. He excused himself at the second hour on the pretense of reviewing correspondence, which was plausible because he always had correspondence, and he followed what he would later identify as the mate pull with the systematic attention of a man who had stopped trying to resist it and was now simply navigating toward the inevitable. She was in the kitchen passage that ran behind the feast hall, cleaning the serving trays that had already made their rounds, and she heard him before she saw him, because she was the kind of person who always heard things first, and she turned and held the tray she was cleaning in both hands, and looked at him with eyes that gave him absolutely nothing and everything at the same time. He had prepared something to say. He stood in the kitchen passage in his road-worn traveling clothes he had not yet changed for the feast, which was itself a statement he had not planned, but found he did not want to walk back. And he looked at her, and every prepared sentence evaporated. "What is your name?" he said. "Mara." Her voice was steady. She had a gift for steadiness that he recognized as learned rather than inherent, which meant she had worked for it, which meant something had required the working. "I don't forgive me. I should be at the back of the hall. I wasn't expecting." "I came here," he said. "You're not in the wrong place." He paused. "You're never in the wrong place." She looked at him. Something moved across her face too quickly to name. "You felt it," he said. He was not asking. She was quiet for a moment that stretched. Then she said carefully, "I have no wolf." He had already known this. It had filtered to him through the aide who had, with admirable efficiency, gathered basic information on all pack members present in the courtyard that evening. He had registered it and set it aside and apparently not set it aside as far as he'd thought, because she was saying it to him now with the specific emphasis of someone delivering news they believe will end a conversation, and he felt Kale stir in his chest with something that felt like contempt for the premise. "That's not what I asked you," he said gently. She set the tray down. Her hands were steady, which cost her something he could see it cost her something. "Yes," she said. "I felt it." The relief was enormous. He had not expected relief. He had expected confirmation, which was different. Confirmation being a thing you receive for something you already knew. This felt like relief, as if some version of this conversation had been going badly in a chamber of his mind he had not known was running. "I'm going to want to speak with you again," he said. "Tomorrow morning, if you're willing, somewhere outside this building." He paused. "With proper time." She studied him. He let her study him. "Why?" she asked. "Because what just happened in that courtyard is not nothing," he said. "And I think you know that, and I think you have spent a long time being told that your sense of what you are is wrong. I'm not going to tell you that." She was quiet. Her eyes were doing the thing again, giving him nothing and everything. He had the sense that she was extraordinarily careful with her trust, and that this carefulness was the right response to her history, and that the path forward was patience. His wolf, to his mild surprise, agreed completely. Kale had not agitated. Kale had settled when she'd said yes. I felt it, with the deep, contented solidity of an animal who has found the right ground to stand on and intends to remain there. "All right," she said finally. "Tomorrow morning." He nodded. He made himself leave. The next morning, she came to the eastern meadow beyond the pack wall, where he'd sent word he would be, and she came alone, which told him she had the kind of courage that did not announce itself, and he had brought no guard, which he knew she would notice, and she did notice. He could tell from the small recalibration in her expression when she arrived and found only him. They talked for 2 hours. He asked about her work, her history, how long she had been in Ironveil. She gave him facts at first, then fuller sentences, and by the end of the first hour she was talking the way a person talks when they have not talked freely in a long time. A certain quality of forward momentum, thoughts connecting to thoughts, her hands moving occasionally to emphasize a point. He listened the way he had taught himself to listen, fully, without preparing his next words while she was still speaking, with the specific quality of attention that treats what someone says as worth the full capacity of a thinking mind. She did not ask why he was so interested. He suspected she was afraid of the answer. He told her about the mate bond carefully, without pressure, as a piece of information she was entitled to have. He explained what he understood of it, which was theoretical and now somewhat overwhelmed by the empirical reality of sitting 3 feet from her in morning light. He told her that it did not require her to do anything she did not choose. She had listened to all of this with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the middle distance, and then she said, very quietly, "But I have no wolf. The bond requires 2 wolves." "The bond requires 2 mates," he said. "That's what the founding texts say. Wolf was the assumed condition, not the requirement." She turned and looked at him fully, and he saw something shift in her, not a wall coming down, more like a person turning to face something they had been standing with their back to. "I've read the founding texts," she said. "I know," he said. He watched her. "What did you find?" And she took a slow breath and said, "Quiet and careful. Containment. The word the oldest text uses is containment, not absence." Kale moved in his chest, warm and definite. "Yes," Aldrich said. "That's what I thought too." The days that followed were structured around his inspection of the pack interviews with ranked members, review of resource allocation records, the formal processes of a territorial audit, and simultaneously structured around her, in the way that things become structured around a gravitational center, even when you are not consciously arranging them that way. He made time each morning and each evening. She came when she could. She could not always, because she had work, and he did not ask her to put the work aside, which she noticed, and which he noticed her noticing. He also noticed everything else. He noticed the way she moved through the pack hall, the careful smallness of her, the apology built into her posture. He noticed Riven, who appeared 3 times in his field of vision over 4 days, and each time made some small adjustment of his trajectory when he saw Aldrich watching. He noticed the pattern of bruises, the shoulder she was favoring, the careful way she reached for things on her left side. He compiled these observations with the flat, methodical attention he used for evidence, and he added them to the record he was building. On the 4th day, Alpha Brennan requested a formal meeting. Aldrich received him in the guest quarters. He had been given a decent set of rooms in the pack's eastern wing, which told him Brennan was a man who understood the value of comfort as a soft form of leverage, and he listened to the Alpha make his case, which was, stripped of its diplomatic layering, roughly, "You are not looking at our supply routes. You are looking at our girl, and this is a problem." "She is an Omega," Brennan said, choosing the word with studied casualness. "Wolfless. It's generous of the Northern Throne to take an interest, but surely—" "The Northern Throne's interests are its own business," Aldrich said pleasantly. "But since you've raised the subject, I'd like to discuss the management of your pack's wolfless members. Specifically, the conditions under which they live and work, and the response or absence of response from pack leadership when those members are physically harmed." The color did its thing again in Brennan's face. Aldrich kept going. He laid out what he had observed and what he had been told, methodically, without heat. He had drafted 3 formal citations for pack management failures. He explained this. He explained the legal framework under Northern Territory law that made physical assault of a pack member a matter that required formal acknowledgement from pack leadership. He explained that he would be returning in 60 days to review compliance. Brennan said very little. Brennan was a man who understood, finally, what kind of ground he was standing on. "One more thing," Aldrich said at the end. "My inspection extends 2 more days. During that time, Mara will be working under direct Northern Throne administrative review. You will communicate this to your staff." What he was doing, and what Brennan certainly understood he was doing, was extending a formal institutional protection over her for the remaining days of his visit. It was not permanent. It was not enough. He knew both of these things, and he had a plan for both, but the plan required her agreement, and her agreement required trust, and trust required time, and he had 2 days. He worked with what he had. He told her that evening in the Eastern Meadow, which had become their place without either of them officially naming it as such, what he had done in the meeting with Brennan. He told her about the citations. He told her about the 60-day review. He told her in a way that communicated he had done it because it was right, and not because it was romantic, because the last thing she needed was to be someone's grand gesture rather than someone whose safety was an unconditional matter. She had listened, and when he finished, she was quiet for long enough that the silence had texture. He'll make things harder when you leave, she said. Not bitterly, practically. I know, he said. That's why I'd like to discuss whether you'd consider. He stopped. He had the words ready. He had prepared them. He said them anyway. Whether you'd consider coming with me. Not as anything other than what you want to be. Not because of the bond, though the bond is real. Because you have been here for 22 years, and this place has not been worthy of you. And because what you carry in you, Mara, what you carry in you, is not nothing. It is not absence. And I would like you to have the space to find out what it is. She looked at him for a long time. You don't know what it is, she said. You might be wrong. I might get to the Northern Throne and be exactly what they've always said. Hollow. I might be wrong, he agreed. Though I don't think I am, and my wolf doesn't think so either. And he has been silent for 2 years and broke that silence in approximately 3 seconds when I rode through that gate. He paused. But yes, I might be wrong. And you could come anyway, because you would be in a better place than this one regardless. And if I'm wrong about what you carry, you can choose what to do from there. She looked away across the meadow. The light was going. The first stars were making their quiet appearance. I have nothing to bring, she said. That's all right, he said. She turned back to him. I would want to be useful, she said. Not kept. I would need to work. I have an entire Northern Territory administration, he said, and a significant shortage of people who have read the founding texts in the original language. Something shifted in her face, the careful, schooled neutrality giving way briefly to something he would describe later as the beginning of wanting something again. I'll come, she said. What happened on the last day before his departure came from a direction he should have anticipated and had not, because he had been paying attention to Brennan and had underestimated Riven. He had always known that the one who hits does not stop hitting simply because the rules have been written down. He had drafted citations. He had communicated institutional protection. He had not been able to be everywhere. She had been gathering her small collection of belongings, which were very few, which was its own kind of testimony from the stable loft where she had slept for years. Riven had found her there. Riven had brought 2 others. He had not been subtle about what he intended. He had been, in fact, exactly as crude and direct about it as a man who had never once faced a real consequence. You think the king is going to fix you? Riven said, while his friends took up their positions at the bottom of the ladder. You think a king wants a hollow girl? You think his wolf actually recognized you? He had laughed, and the laugh had the specific ugliness of something that has been rehearsed. You have no wolf. You are nothing. You are exactly what you've always been. And when he figures that out, he's going to figure it out right now, Aldrich said from the stable door. The silence was immediate and total. He had been 3 minutes behind her. The mate pull had done what it did. He had moved faster than he normally would have allowed himself to move through someone else's pack territory, not caring about the statement it made, and he was standing in the stable entrance with the light behind him and 31 years of accumulated control and something quite a lot larger than control behind that. Riven turned slowly. Down, Aldrich said, quietly. Just the one word. Both of Riven's friends moved toward the door with remarkable speed. Riven himself was slower. He had, Aldrich noted, the specific stupidity of a man who had never had to calculate real consequences and therefore didn't know how. She doesn't have a wolf, Riven said. She can't be your mate. It's not possible. What's not possible, Aldrich said, still very quietly, crossing the stable floor with measured steps, is that you have been allowed to behave this way for as long as you have. I've reviewed the records. I've spoken to 17 members of this pack in the last 4 days. 17 accounts. Some of them go back 12 years. He stopped in front of Riven. He was slightly taller than Riven, and he used the slight difference without exaggeration, simply standing in it. You are going to leave this building. You are going to present yourself to Alpha Brennan and report your own conduct. If you don't, the 3 formal citations currently attached to this pack's record will become criminal referrals, and your uncle will answer for them, and you will answer for them separately. Riven looked at him, looked at Mara, who was standing in the loft with her small bundle of belongings and her steady hands, looked back at Aldrich. He left. Aldrich waited until the stable door had shut, and then he turned and looked up at her. And she was looking down at him from the loft with the expression of someone who has been waiting their whole life for a thing they had stopped expecting, and it has just arrived. And she did not know yet what to do with both feelings existing simultaneously. Come down, he said. Gently, she climbed down. He was there at the bottom of the ladder, not touching her, but close. And she turned from the last rung and was standing in the narrow space in front of him, with her bundle in her hands, and her eyes bright with something she was still holding back. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Yes, I did," he said. "Simple as that." She looked up at him. He could feel her working through something he had learned, her working through something face in the last 4 days. The small vertical line between her brows, the quality of attention that went inward before it came back out. He waited. "What if you're right about the containment?" she said. "And what it contains is something, what if it's something that—" She stopped. "Something frightening?" he offered. She nodded. "Then it's something frightening," he said. "And it is yours. And it does not become less yours if it frightens people. And no one who matters to me is going to ask you to unmake it." She looked at him for a long time. Cale was very still in his chest, the warm, certain still of having arrived. "I'm going to need time," she said. "I have time," he said. The journey north took 6 days on horseback, and what happened during those 6 days was not dramatic. There was no single moment, no thunderclap, no formal declaration. What there was instead was time, which turned out to be the thing she needed most, and which he had and was glad to give. They rode, they talked, they ate around fires in the evenings with his guard close enough to be present and far enough to be absent, and she began gradually, in increments too small to measure individually, but significant in aggregate to unfold. He learned about the texts she had read, and she was astonished that he had read some of them too. And they argued pleasantly about an interpretation in the third founding document, and she was right, and he told her so, and she looked at him as if no one had ever done that before, and maybe no one had. He learned that she had a dry, precise humor that emerged mostly when she was comfortable and was quietly devastating when it arrived. He learned that she had a habit of going still when she was working through a problem that could be mistaken for absence, but was in fact its opposite, pure presence, directed inward. He learned that his wolf did not quiet around her, but he did not agitate either. Cale settled, which was different, a low, contented warmth, a sense of rightness so complete it had no jagged edges. He told her this, carefully, on the 4th evening. She was quiet after he did. They were sitting by the fire, not particularly close enough. Then she said, "Since the courtyard, since I looked up at you, something that has been pressing against the inside of my chest my whole life has been pressing differently, like it found a direction." He was careful. "In a good way?" She thought about it. "In a real way," she said, which I think might be the same thing. He reached across the short distance between them and took her hand, and she let him. And they stayed like that for a while in the dark, with the fire between them and the horses, quiet, and the night very large and still around them. It was on the 5th day out, with the Northern Throne's first watchtowers visible on the horizon, that she told him about the text. Not the summary she had given him before the full thing, the page she had memorized. The exact language of the original passage about contained wolves and non-standard gifts, and the specific phrase that had undone her. "Those who carry the whole will not announce it in the ordinary ways." She recited it from memory while they rode, and he listened, and at the end he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I've been to the archive at the Northern Throne 7 times looking for that text. We've known it exists, we couldn't find it." She looked at him. "It was in a stable loft in Ironveil," she said, wrapped in oilcloth. He processed this. He said, "How would you feel about working in the archive?" She said, "I would feel like the moon goddess has a specific sense of humor." He laughed. The laugh surprised him, arrived without calculation. Cale purred in his chest. He reached over and caught her hand again briefly as they rode, and she squeezed his fingers and let go. On the afternoon of the 6th day, they rode through the outer gate of the Northern Throne's seat, a city, really, built across 3 hills and a river valley, stone and silver-gray timber and light bouncing off the river in long, bright lines. She had never seen anything this large. He watched her take it in, the way her eyes moved, the small, involuntary breath she took when the full scope of it came visible. "This is your territory," she said. "Not a question, a kind of taking in." "It is," he said, "and yours now if you want it." She looked at him. Something in her was less defended than it had been 6 days ago. Not unguarded, She had not shed the careful habits of 22 years overnight, and she wouldn't, and he didn't expect her to, but less defended. Like a door that has been held shut for so long that, when it finally opens, it moves on its own weight, not because it was pushed. "Show me the archive first," she said. He laughed again. It still surprised him. It would probably always surprise him, and he was beginning to think he was glad of that. The archive was in the north wing of the palace, a proper archive, not a loft, with catalogued shelves and climate-managed storage, and 3 full-time scholars who looked up when Aldrich brought Mara in, and who very quickly understood, from the way he was standing, that this was not a casual visit, and who looked at Mara with the specific evaluative attention of people who care about their books and want to know if this person does too. She walked directly to the oldest section she could feel it, she said later, and he believed her completely and stood before a shelf of foundational texts and reached out one hand and very gently touched the spine of one volume. And the lead scholar made a small sound and said to Aldrich without looking away from her, "She knows which one it is." Aldrich said nothing. Kale was a warm, solid presence in his chest. "Can I?" Mara began. "Please," the scholar said, and meant it. She took the volume from the shelf and opened it to a page she did not have to search for, and read. And whatever she was reading was doing something to her face, not dissolving it, not crumpling it, something quieter than that, something settling. She looked up at Aldrich. "It's here," she said, "the complete version. There are 3 more pages that the Ironveil copy didn't have." He came to stand beside her and look at the page. She moved slightly to make room for him, which was the first time she had adjusted her own space to include him rather than waiting to see if space would be made, and he noticed it and said nothing, because there were things you did not name when they were still new. 3 days later, in the early morning, she woke from a dead sleep with both hands pressed to her sternum, and Aldrich was there because he had been sleeping on the wrong side of a wall for 2 nights. And had given up this particular exercise in restraint around midnight, and he was in the chair across from her bed when she woke with a sound like a name, and he crossed the room before she'd fully surfaced. "It's moving," she said. Her eyes were wide and clear and not frightened, though she'd had cause to be, but present, fully present, with both hands on her own chest like she was feeling something reshaping itself. Aldrich, I can feel it moving." He sat on the edge of the bed and put his hands over hers without thinking, and she held them there, and Kale was on his feet in his chest for the first time in years. On his feet, not running, just standing and attending, like a wolf who has found what he was sent to find. She made a sound he had no language for, not pain, something past pain, the thing after pain when the source of it resolves. Her back straightened, both of them still with their hands pressed to her sternum. And then she exhaled a breath she seemed to have been holding for 22 years, and her eyes filled. And she did not try to stop the tears, which was the first time he had seen her not try to stop them. "I'm not hollow," she said. "I never was." He moved the hands hers and his together one small degree, and then he said, low and direct and permanent, "How could I ever have thought you were? How could I have looked at you for one moment and thought you were anything less than this?" She made a sound that was a laugh and a sob arriving at the same time, and leaned her forehead against his shoulder, and he let her and stayed completely still. What she was, what the containment had held, was not a standard wolf. The scholars who examined her in the days that followed used words like composite and integrated, which were technical words that pointed at something older. The founding texts, once they had the complete version, were more direct about it. A wolf bound to its human, not as a separate interior animal, but as a unified form, capable of full shift, capable of all the bond functions, carrying none of the separation that ordinary wolves and their humans negotiated throughout a lifetime. Not 2 beings sharing a body, 1 being, complete, that had simply not found its full form yet. She shifted for the first time 10 days after arriving at the northern throne, in the open ground of the inner ward, with Aldrich 12 feet away and the 3 scholars taking notes, and his guard standing back, and several members of the palace staff watching from the upper windows, because word had traveled in the way word always travels. It was not a smooth first shift. It was not graceful. She went to her knees twice and made sounds he would have crossed a room for under any other circumstances. And he stayed at 12 feet because she had asked him to stay at 12 feet, and her autonomy in this was not negotiable. But she came through it. She came through it, and what stood in the winter morning light of the inner ward was a wolf so dark she was nearly black, with golden eyes, and a stillness so total it seemed like the whole ward had oriented itself around her without knowing it had moved. Aldrich's wolf rose in his chest with a sound like every bell in the northern throne ringing at once. She shifted back in under a minute and stood there on human feet in the ruins of a shirt she had already resigned herself to losing, and looked at him across the 12 feet. And he was looking back at her with an expression he was not trying to control, which was unusual for him. And she said, "You were right." "I know," he said, and the warmth in his voice was of the specific variety that comes from relief so enormous it has become something else. "That's insufferable," she said. "I'll work on it," he said. The formal assembly happened 3 weeks later. When he had not planned to hold one, it arrived from necessity, not theater, when his council formally requested clarification on the status of the woman who had been seen shifting in the inner ward, and who was, apparently, reading foundational documents in the archive with a level of comprehension that was making the scholars competitive about who got to discuss the passages with her. He held the assembly in the main hall, his full council, his senior pack representatives, 3 neighboring alpha delegates who had arrived for a treaty discussion and had simply remained for this, because word, as noted, travels. He stood at the head of the hall and he said what was true, plainly, without decoration. "She is my fated mate. She is wolf-born in a form the founding text document and our current taxonomy failed to recognize. She is the person who found, in a stable loft in the Midlands, the complete version of the 3rd founding document that this administration has been looking for 11 years. He paused. "She will be formally acknowledged as my mate and as a scholar of the foundational canon. If anyone has a concern about her origins, her rank, or her status before this court, they may bring it directly to me and I will address it directly." He looked at the hall. The hall was quiet. He had what he needed here, not unanimous enthusiasm, but the specific silence of people calibrating the ground, understanding that this is not a debate, but a declaration, filing away the fact of it for future reference. Then, because the hall needed it and because Aldrich had found, over the past 3 weeks, that his own quality of control had quietly reorganized itself around a new center too, he looked at where she was standing at the edge of the hall. She had refused to stand next to him for the declaration, which he had understood and accepted. She had said she needed to receive this as herself first, before she received it as his. And he said, louder, direct, non-negotiable in the way only true things said, plainly are non-negotiable. "You are not hollow. You were never hollow. You were the whole, waiting to be found. And I am not a man who lets a finding like that go unnamed in front of witnesses." She looked at him from the edge of the hall with her 22 years, and her careful eyes and her wolf settled inside her like a word finally spoken aloud, and she crossed the floor toward him, and the hall watched her do it, and she did not make herself small. She had learned to make herself small. She had spent 22 years perfecting the art of it, and she spent the rest of her life unlearning it, starting from the moment she walked across that hall floor under 100, watching eyes with her shoulders straight and her chin level, toward the man whose wolf had recognized her before either of them had understood what they were standing in, and she stopped in front of him, and she looked up, and she said quietly meant only for him, though the hall heard it anyway, because the hall was listening for exactly this. "I found something too." He took her face in both hands, and he kissed her in front of the full assembly and 3 neighboring delegates, and everyone who had ever needed to understand that the Alpha King of the Northern Throne did not take the things that mattered lightly. And the hall was not silent this time. And Mara, who had been born into a pack that called her hollow, who had survived 22 years on careful silence and borrowed candlelight, and the stubborn, unreasonable persistence of a hope she had never quite managed to extinguish, felt her wolf rise warm and certain in her chest like an answer arriving home, and the mate bond settled over them both, like something that had always been true and had simply been waiting for them to catch up.